It's the middle of winter. Food ran out 3 days ago. Your grandfather can no longer walk fast enough to keep up with the group. Everyone knows what happens next. And somehow, everyone has already accepted it. This isn't a movie. For parts of human history, this was simply Tuesday. We just told you how some ancient societies cared for their elderly with incredible tenderness, feeding, protecting, keeping people alive long after they stopped being useful. That was real. But it wasn't universal, not even close. Because in some cultures, when someone grew too old to keep up, the answer wasn't care. It was something almost unthinkable. Something most people assume only happened in dark fairy tales, not real, documented history. Before we go further, let's play a quick game. I'm going to describe 4 things ancient cultures supposedly did to their elderly. You decide for each one. Real history or myth that got mistaken for history. First, elderly people abandoned alone in a blizzard, on purpose, with everyone's quiet agreement. Second, a secret figure who visited dying elders in the night, carrying a small wooden mallet. Third, an entire mountain where old women were carried up and left to die, so common it had its own name. Fourth, an old man, given the choice by his own children, simply stops eating, and everyone lets him. Take a second right now and actually pick your 4 answers before you keep watching. Real, 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 real. Or maybe not all 4. You'll want to know if you guessed right. Hold on to your guesses, because the real answer is stranger and more specific than any of us expected. Anthropologists have a clinical name for this general practice: senicide, the deliberate killing or abandonment to death of the elderly. Let's start with the blizzard. This is the most famous version of this story. Inuit communities, harsh winters, an elder left behind. Here's the twist almost nobody knows. Modern anthropologists now call this a pervasive European myth, repeated by explorers for centuries, copied from writer to writer until it was treated as fact. In most Inuit communities, elders were never abandoned. They were the community's memory, walking libraries of survival knowledge in a culture with no written language. Getting rid of them made no sense at all, but, and this is the part that makes the myth so hard to fully dismiss, a small number of real, specific, documented cases do exist. In the 1920s, explorer Knud Rasmussen recorded senicide among the Netsilik Inuit during genuine famine, describing elders who said, quote, "All old people who can do no more, and whom death will not take, help death to take them." When it happened, the methods were exactly as brutal as you'd imagine: strangulation, stabbing, being left out in the open to freeze, sometimes simply walked away from during a blizzard and never looked for again. And when it comes to where they were buried, often they weren't. No grave, no marker, just left exactly where death found them, in the snow, to be taken by the land itself. One of the very last confirmed cases was recorded in the early 1930s. A son abandoning his own mother in a blizzard on purpose, within a few generations of people alive today. So our guess number 1, not simply real, but incredibly rare and mostly mythologized far beyond what the evidence supports. In classical antiquity, researchers have documented 87 recorded cases of elderly people taking their own lives, and historians actually broke down exactly why. 20 were driven by impatience with old age itself, 17 by humiliation, 12 by vanity, refusing to be seen as weak, 10 simply by unbearable suffering. The method, by far the most common: starvation, a slow, deliberate refusal to eat, sometimes with the family's quiet, painful understanding. Which brings us to guess number 4, the old man who stops eating and everyone lets him. That one is real. Real enough that historians could count and categorize dozens of cases. Now, guess number 2. The secret figure with the mallet. This one might be the strangest of all 4. In Sardinia, there's historical record of a folk figure called Sa Acabadora, roughly translated, she who finishes. She was summoned quietly, at night, only when death was already certain and painfully slow, when medicine, prayer, and time had all already failed. She would arrive without ceremony and end the suffering with a small ceremonial mallet, a single, deliberate strike meant to be fast rather than prolonged. This wasn't treated as murder by the community. It was treated as mercy. The family would grieve and then bury their relative normally, exactly as they would anyone else who had died of illness. Incredibly, accounts of this role persist in parts of Sardinia into the early 20th century, not deep prehistory, barely 100 years ago. And here's a detail worth sitting with. Descendants of families connected to this role reportedly still exist in Sardinia today. Understandably, most don't want to talk about it. So, guess number 2. Also real. Confirmed, specific, and unsettlingly recent. That's 3 out of 4 so far. Which brings us to guess number 3. The Mountain of Abandoned Old Women. This is the famous Japanese legend of Obasuteyama, the mountain where old women are abandoned. For decades, it was treated almost as historical fact, referenced in essays, even taught as real history. Here's the twist. Modern anthropological analysis suggests it was never a real routine custom at all. It was a folktale, a cautionary story warning against neglecting your parents, not a record of what people actually did. Interestingly, Sweden has its own nearly identical legend, a supposed cliff called Ättestupa, where the old would leap to their deaths. Researchers now believe this too was likely myth, not routine practice, the story surviving far better than any actual evidence of it happening. So, out of 4, 2 were real and rare. 1 was real and specific. And 1, maybe 2 counting Sweden, were myths so well told they were mistaken for memory. That pattern shows up constantly in history. A frightening story gets repeated by explorers and historians generation after generation until it quietly becomes common knowledge that never actually happened the way people assume. So which is the real picture of ancient old age, the tenderness we covered earlier, or the abandonment? The uncomfortable answer is both, depending entirely on how much the environment could afford to be kind. In stable times, with enough food and safety, most ancient societies kept their elders close, valued for memory, skill, and knowledge younger members hadn't learned yet. But push the same society into true, sustained crisis, famine, war, a brutal migration with no food left to share, and a small number of cultures made an almost unthinkable calculation, not out of cruelty, out of brutal survival math with no good option left. What's striking is that in nearly every confirmed case, it wasn't framed as murder. It was framed as sacrifice or mercy. The elder often chose it, or at least accepted it, as their final contribution to the people they loved. That doesn't make it any less devastating, but it does make it something very different from what the word killing first suggests. And here's something modern researchers have pointed out that might make this feel a little closer to home than you'd expect. Some public health researchers now draw a direct, uncomfortable line between ancient Senicide and something happening quietly in modern medicine. Elderly patients requesting assisted death, specifically because they feel like a burden to their families. In surveys of these patients, feeling like a burden is cited almost as often as physical pain itself as the reason. Different century, different tools, possibly the same underlying calculation, just wearing a modern disguise. Modern life has mostly removed us from the most extreme version of that choice. Food doesn't run out because winter came early. Nobody has to choose between carrying grandmother or letting the children eat. But for most of human history, that impossible math was real. And a small number of cultures were forced to solve it in ways we can barely imagine choosing ourselves. It's worth sitting with that for a second. Not pain, not illness, just the quiet fear of being a burden. The exact same fear that drove a handful of real, documented decisions on Arctic ice generations ago. So, out of 4 guesses, how many did you actually get right? If you got it that most were real but wildly exaggerated, you already understand this better than most explorers who wrote about it a century ago. Thanks for watching. If this changed how you think about something you assumed was simple, subscribe to Bone and Fire.